When most people hear that God created man and woman in His image, they tend to think of something spiritual, an invisible likeness. In this traditional understanding, being made in God's image doesn't mean that humans physically look like God. Instead, it means we reflect His character, His moral nature, or His capacity for reason and relationship. In other words, humans are like God in function, not in form. We have the ability to think, to create, to choose right from wrong, and to represent God's rule over creation. But Dr. Kipp Davis, in his book God's Propaganda, Pulling Back the Curtain on What the Bible Wants You to See, argues something far more concrete, and honestly, I think it's spot on. According to Dr. Kipp, when Genesis says humanity was created in the image and likeness of God, it's describing a physical resemblance. The form of God, he says, is not just a symbol of divine qualities. It's an embodied form. That means, in the Genesis story, the first humans aren't abstract reflections of divine attributes. They are tangible, visible representations of God Himself. Their bodies mirror God's own bodily form. Dr. Kipp writes that the human being, Adam, bears a bodily resemblance to the divine creator, and that this resemblance gives humanity its superiority over the other creatures of the world. Even more specifically, Dr. Kipp suggests that the likeness should be understood as a representation of God's face. It's almost like a portrait or a sculpted bust, a visible manifestation of God's appearance. In his words, His face is our face. This is a radical shift from the metaphorical interpretations that dominate much of theology. For Dr. Kipp, humanity presences God in the world through its physicality. Humans are the living, breathing embodiments of God's form, placed in creation to carry out His functions and authority. So while traditional theology might say that being made in God's image means sharing His nature, Dr. Kipp's view suggests it means sharing His appearance. And that changes how we might see not just Genesis, but the entire biblical portrayal of God, as one whose divine being is expressed quite literally in human form. In the ancient Near Eastern imagination, the gods were not vaporous spirits floating in a separate spiritual realm. They were embodied beings, tangible and material, though dwelling in places just beyond the reach of ordinary human life. The ancient worldview was monistic, meaning it didn't sharply divide the physical from the spiritual as modern thought often does. Everything, divine or mortal, had some form of substance. The gods lived and worked in the divine realm, not because it was immaterial, but because it existed on the distant edges of the known world, high in the heavens, deep underground, or across the sea beyond the horizon. They were believed to look and act much like people or animals, eating, drinking, building, fighting, celebrating, and creating. Their lives were the extensions of the same physical reality humans inhabited, only magnified and perfected in divine form. Because the gods were understood as embodied beings, their presence on earth was also expressed through physical forms. Dr. Kipp Davis explains that the many idols and figurines discovered throughout ancient Palestine and Israel weren't seen as the gods themselves, but as tangible manifestations of their activity and authority. Their statues and cult images made the divine visible within the human realm. They represented the god's being and function, not just symbolically, but materially. As Dr. Kipp notes, on earth, the gods live only in images, in the king as an image of God, in cult images in the temples, and in sacred animals, plants, and objects. In that world, an image didn't merely point to a god. It hosted the god's presence. The divine could inhabit its likeness, allowing humans to encounter and serve their deities through physical, visible forms. According to the Bible, we are God's idols. This has caused me to rethink a few verses. Take Psalm 115, 4-7, for example. Speaking of foreign gods, it says, "Their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths, but do not speak, eyes, but do not see. They have ears, but do not hear, noses, but do not smell. They have hands, but do not feel, feet, but do not walk, and they do not make a sound in their throat." There are several of these types of verses in the Hebrew Bible, and I always thought it was comparing the idols to God, but they were comparing the idols to us, to humans. But Dr. Kipp, I think, leaves room to develop the idea further. If human beings were understood as the physical representations of a deity, then the setting in which they were placed, the world itself, was also conceived in the same way. As John Walton points out, temples in the ancient Near East were not simply places of worship. They were symbolic models of the cosmos. Both biblical and extra-biblical sources reveal that temple architecture reflected the ordered structure of the universe. Walton notes that the temple is, for all intents and purposes, the cosmos. The temple's design, with its gradations of holiness and restricted access, mirrored the perceived organization of reality itself. From the inhabited world outside to the heavens, and finally to the divine sphere represented by the innermost sanctuary. Maintaining order within the temple was therefore equivalent to maintaining order in the cosmos. Dr. Kipp recognizes a similar correspondence in his discussion on the Jerusalem temple, which he describes as a physical reflection of God's work in creation. Its architectural layout, with sacred zones, boundaries, and limited sightlines, reproduced the process of separating chaos from order, as depicted in the Genesis creation narrative. The temple thus functioned as a miniature version of the structured universe. But Walton extends this principle one step further. If the temple represents the cosmos, then the cosmos itself can be understood as a temple. Following this line of reasoning, humans, conceived as physical images of the deity, occupy in the cosmos the same role that statues played within temples. In this way, both temple and the cosmos, and both idol and human, participated in the same logic of image and embodiment that defined ancient Near East religion. This understanding of how God is physically reflected by humans may help us better understand the Adam and Eve story. Dr. Kipp takes an allegorical approach to the story of Adam and Eve. For him, the garden narrative reflects on aspects of human enterprise and identity. The story of creation in the garden was a reflection on human enterprise. The Adam was a farmer, a pastoralist, or a herdsman, and a sexual being. In other words, the myth dramatizes what it means to be human in practical and embodied terms. When examining the creation of Eve, Dr. Kipp argues that the narrative centers on sexuality. He writes, "What is really at the heart of the story is a fixation on sex and the strange connection that ancient people made between sex and divinity. Perhaps the physical euphoria of lovemaking prompted people from time immemorial to envision sexual activity as in some way beyond human limitation. But that's not what I see happening here. I think the biblical author may have been trying to do a couple of things. Let's start by taking a look at Genesis 2, verses 23 through 24. Here's what Dr. Kipp says about it. When Yahweh brings the woman to the Adam in Genesis 2, 23 through 24, upon seeing her, he exclaims, 'This one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for from man was she taken.' It is a lovely picture of sexual union that truly sets the creation of the woman in proper view, especially relative to the rest of the animals. Bone from my bones and flesh from my flesh. She is not just made from the same stuff as the Adam, she is part of him, from the very beginning. But that phrase, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, isn't about sex. It's about having the same point of origin. We see something similar when the Israelites talk about David. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, 'We are your own flesh and blood.' That doesn't mean they wanted to have sex with him, but that they descended from the same ancestor. Of course, in Genesis 2, it's more about how Eve came to be than it is about her family tree. So the phrasing isn't exactly the same. But if we strip away the propaganda and reconstruct the original narrative, we see that Eve was originally a goddess. For a full breakdown of my view on how Adam and Eve came to be sure to check out my video on the Garden of Eden narrative. My point being that the biblical author was trying to shift her point of origin from a goddess to Adam. Genesis 5 may have been trying to make the same point in verse 1, where it says, 'On the day when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female.' To explain this, we need to go back to what we said about the image of God, that we physically look like God. But what if someone is a different race, or had different colored skin, different colored eyes, or different colored hair? How could everyone look like the same God if they all look different? It seems that at least some people in the ancient Near East believed that different gods created different groups of people, and each group looked like the God that created them. In my blog post about Job, I strip away the propaganda and different layers to show that originally Job was created by the god El. The oral tradition about Job and El. To summarize, Job was created out of clay by El, became wicked, was killed by El, descended into Sheol and cursed El, repented of his wickedness, and was resurrected by El. Men and women typically look different from each other as well, And this brings us back to Genesis 5, verse 1. The biblical author here wants the reader to know that the female was not created by a different God than the male. But what about men and women becoming one flesh? How does that relate to all this? Dr. Kipp takes this as having to do with sex too. But I think that this also has to do with the origin of the woman. In a tribal society, after a woman was married, whose family was she considered part of? Her own or her husband's? What tribe was she considered a part of? Her own or her husband's? From the husband's perspective, was she one of us or one of them? And vice versa. This harkens back again to what the Israelites said about David. They were of the same flesh and blood. They were of the same tribe, the tribe of Israel. And I think the author of Genesis is trying to say the same thing. When a man and woman cleave together, they become part of the same family and tribe. This fluid idea of family was not exclusive from marriage. Dr. Kipp talks about how others could be incorporated into a tribe. Quote, but becoming part of a clan or a tribe was not exclusively through birth or marriage. The same system of organization has been in place for many centuries among numerous Arab nomadic groups, like the Bedouin. And we see here that new members could be incorporated into a tribe through adoption or acceptance by the elders. The great French archaeologist Roland Devaux explained how this might follow in view of rather fixed ideas about family. But even here, the principle is safeguarded, for the newcomer is attached in name and blood to the tribe. This means he acknowledges the tribe's ancestor as his own, that he will marry within the tribe and raise up his family inside it. The Arabs say that he is genealogized. With a whole clan, the fusion takes longer, but the result is the same, and the newcomers are finally considered as being of the same blood. Unquote. But it was with marriage that this was most critical, because such an issue needed to be resolved to deal most efficiently with inheritance and offspring. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and please like, share, and subscribe.